Hello and welcome once again to the Windy City's finest, on location with Mac and Perry. He's Mac, I'm Perry, and this is...
Don.
Thank you so much for inviting us into your space here, your studio. It's wonderful. And yeah, agreeing to spend some time with us and chat. I'll just kind of pass it to you really briefly here about if you were to give a broad kind of overview of what it is you do, how would you describe that?
Well, that's a good question, because I do so many things, but as little as possible of all of them. So. But photography has always been core to what I do. And walking, or moving through space, looking at space at a walking pace. So, and history, looking at things from a historical perspective as well, what would this look like in such a time, and what did it have looked like at such a time in the past. So, so it's in a sense it's a combination of photography, performance art, installation, and something else, video, collecting, all of those things. In other words, artistic stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like a wide palette of things, so that's awesome, yeah. Great, and we're just going to dive right into our first little mini game here, which is in the spirit of being on location. It's just some multiple choice questions about Lethbridge, fun facts that I've learned, and we'll just take a guess and see what happens. So our first question for you, Dawn, is before it became the Galt Museum, the Galt was A, an observatory, B, a coal plant, C, a hospital, or D, a dance studio?
It was a hospital.
It sure was a hospital, yeah. How do you know that? How did you come across that?
Well, I'm a member of the Galt.
Oh, yeah.
So, but I also look at the history of Lethbridge considerably, considering that it's always been my interest, and sort of, around the idea. I've lived in many, many places, and I've always been interested in the history of the origins of that place, both in a colonial sense and a pre-colonial sense. So I do a lot of research on that matter. And it also informs what I do.
Right,
as an artist. So.
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind that moving through space, understanding the space is what kind of comes to mind for me, but yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so you can see a lot when you're walking.
Yeah. Our next question for you is, Lethbridge had a system of streetcars for how many years before switching to motor buses in 1947? A, 33 years, B, 15 years, C, 35 years, or D, 1 year?
I would say 33 or 35.
Yeah, it was C, 35 years, between 1912 and 1947, yeah. Yeah, and that would be something else that you just have come across in your research?
It was, but also there was an exhibition at the Casa Gallery, about when they were pulling the train, the tracks up. So the history of the trolleys became quite apparent, and also. I used to be a transit driver in Vancouver, driving electric buses and diesel buses, etc., as well as other. Anyway, so I have an interest in the idea of within how a city operates in terms of transit, of walking, of whatever, outside the idea of the car city.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. I think we'll move swiftly along to our next mini game, and it's this or that. So I'll let you do the honors and pick the first one, and we'll see what we get and see if we talk about it at all. And you can read it out once you've picked it.
It's printed upside down. 8, truck or car?
Truck or car? If you're getting around, do you have a preference?
Currently a car, station wagon. I used to have pickups, mini pickups, with a little camperette on the back for my travels, but currently a car.
Nice. And yeah, like you mentioned, having like for your travels, something on the back of trucks typically?
Well, it was a little Hilux. Well, later on it was a Nissan, but two of them. The Toyota, the Hilux had a little camperette, which is like a small camper.
Yeah.
But very tiny.
Yeah.
So it was quite handy for, traveling,
Yeah.
camping or whatnot. I drove it one year from, I was in Vancouver. I drove it from Vancouver to down to the Baja Peninsula, and then up to Inuvik and back in the 1 year. So.
Oh wow, put some miles on it.
Yeah, but it was great because the camperette, you just hop in the back.
Yeah. Has that always been a thing for you, like since you were a kid, or was that something you found in adulthood, or?
Moving around?
Yeah, like camping and.
Well, no, we used to camp as a kid. I mean, and also, I'm from Cranbrook originally, and my father's from Cranbrook, and his father moved there his great I don't know. Anyway, long time. And but he moved to Calgary for work. Then we'd always spend the rest of the year driving back and forth between Cranbrook and Calgary because Cranbrook was his home,
right?
And we had family there, etc. So anyway, we just spent moving back and forth, and then in the summer times we do car camping. So it became part of our lives.
Nice, great. I'll pick the next one. See what comes up. We have got board game or video game.
Board game.
Did you play board games growing up, or do you get to play them much now? I know I don't.
Well, when I was growing up, we played board games in the family quite a bit. Like all the standards. And then when I tried out video games one year, and I found them too addictive and not that interesting. I mean, they were interesting in the sense that they were addictive.
You're right.
So I had to go cold turkey. And now we play. The only time we play board games now is camping. We play Snakes and Ladders.
Love it.
With our partner's friend who has a intellectual disability. She loves playing, so and she makes up the rules as we go along, which is more fun.
Oh, absolutely. I don't doubt it. Yeah. Nice. Great. I'll let you do the honors and pick another one.
A curly question. Bury or cremate?
Ooh, serious questions.
Like my victims or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, personally,
okay,
what would
my
be your
personal
preference?
preference? Well, I used to be cremate, but I'm moving towards a green burial now because it's you're less consumption because gas is uses a lot of gas and it goes in the atmosphere, and a green burial just makes more sense.
Yeah. And was there a specific thing that made that switch for you, or are you still kind of between the two, or?
Well, the closer it gets, the less interested I am, as they say. Well, but I am, because we have no children. So, and we have a family's plot in Cranbrook, going back to my great-grandfather.
Yeah.
But it's getting less used, and so cremation, I could get my ashes dumped there, but you just hand it to someone on the street and ask them to travel down and do it. But and otherwise, it's just that green burials are becoming more accessible now. So and less intrusive in the environment.
Yeah. And I find it interesting what you say about the closer it gets, the less interested you are. I think that's interesting because I think I'm not sure how often I think about that, but it's a thing that happens. And,
What's the idea of moving from theory to practice?
I see. Yeah.
So it's that margin.
Yeah, right on. Okay, I think I'll pick the next one, and then we'll move along. Rich or famous? If you had to pick one.
I would pick neither.
Okay. Why?
I would tend towards, well, famous, is something in itself. It's become celebrity culture. We live in this kind of celebrity culture, so if you're famous, then it becomes, unless you're very, I don't know. I mean, I've always looked at the idea that I'm not that interested in money. If I have enough money, then I'm happy.
Right.
I don't need too much. I don't need more than I can use. And the famous, comes with obligations.
Absolutely.
And it's an intrusion into time. And it's also an idea of anonymity. Like being a photographer or a photographic-oriented person. It was like a line from Cartier-Bresson, who was a famous French photographer. I don't know if you knew him or not.
I do.
But he's like one of the iconic photographers of street photography of sorts. And what he said one time was that, and he became famous, and people started following him. He had students, and people wanted to interview him, et cetera, et cetera. So he quit photography and started drawing. Because he said, what he said was that, I'm a photographer, and my whole existence is based upon being someone who's not noticeable.
Right. And
once you become noticeable, or people recognize you, then you lose your ability to do what I do. So.
That's really beautiful, yeah. And totally valid response, and neither, it sounds like. So, yeah, nice. We'll move along to our tumbling towers. So each block corresponds to a question, and we can't use the top three. Okay. And then ideally we take one and we put it on top. Do you want to go first?
I will. I'll take this one. Number 7, because that was our family's address.
Okay.
In Calgary.
Number 7. So, what are you reading right now?
Remarkably, well, I read incessantly. So I'm reading a book called Land, which is sort of the history of private property.
Okay.
And how it originated, and sort of how it works within a contemporary context and historical context. That the idea of moving land from outside of the public realm into a private realm. And so that's one thing I'm reading.
Yeah.
By Simon Winchester is his name,
okay.
I believe. Listening in the car, I'm listening currently to David Copperfield, an audiobook of David Copperfield, which I thought was, because I never read David Copperfield, but I did read the book by Barbara Kingsolver called Demon Copperhead, which is a contemporary rewriting of David Copperfield set in Appalachia, and based around the opioid epidemic. So I wanted to compare those two. And also Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I just finished listening to, and also reading it at the same time, like looking at how it works within a performed version versus a read version. And then down here, I also have these two books.
Wonderful.
I'm reading about looking.
About
by
looking.
John Berger, which is interesting to me because this is what a lot of the work in my last exhibition was based upon. It was an essay in here about why we look at animals. And then Walkscapes by Francesco Carrari, which is the idea, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
Has set up a lot of ideas around the conceptualization of a walking practice.
Very interesting.
As an artist or as an architect. Yeah. He's an architect.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I love the different, I love that idea of, taking in a story audibly as well as visually. I think that's fascinating. And I'm sure, we'll dive into the specifics of these sorts of things and how they pertain to your practice in another segment, probably with Mac. But I'm curious, has this always been a part of your life or practice, like reading or listening to audiobooks?
Well, not listening to audiobooks, that's fairly recent. But reading has been a part of my life ever since I learned to read. And walking.
And walking. Nice. Great. I will pick a block and we'll see what comes up.
Okay.
Let's try this one. Whoop. That is 34. What's one talent that you wish you had?
One talent I wish I had.
Yeah.
Well, there's many talents that I wish I had. Schmoozing is I think, a talent. I wish I had.
Absolutely.
Because that's sort of integral to an artist's existence, and I'm terrible at it. So that would be one thing.
Schmoozing, very interesting. I've never heard that before. But like you say, yeah, it can be an integral part of meeting people and whatnot. And
Well, it is, especially, you know, curators, other artists, you know, making contacts. I mean, the whole idea of an art practice or profession as an artist is the idea that you're working within a large field. And, you know, the artists who are isolated have no outlet. So in order, you know, so we need to, you need, you know, curators, gallery owners, other artists, residency professionals, etc.
yeah. And it brings to mind, I think we're kind of at our time here, but I think this is a wonderful note to end off on just that idea of trying to remain anonymous, but in relation to other people. And I think that's, I don't know if you have anything to say about that to kind of wrap up here at this segment, but that was just a parallel I was seeing, trying to remain anonymous, but that you are in relation with others, and that balance, I don't know, but
yeah, no, it is. It's the thing is, you still. I mean, the idea of working within the art community. I mean, you can be well known in the art community, but still be anonymous.
Right.
Being as how this is Canada. That it's, you know, most artists in the country are publicly anonymous.
Right. Yeah.
And it takes a lot to be not.
Right.
So I'm pretty comfortable in my anonymity.
Nice.
I have a great company.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you so much for your insight. Yeah, this has been the Windy City's Finest, on location with Mac and Perry.
Welcome to the Windy City's Finest, on location with Mac and Perry. I'm Mac, he's Perry, and this is...
I'm Don.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us, Don. In that first segment, we learned a bit about you and your life a little bit. And this segment, I really am curious about your artistic practice, learning about what you do, why you do it, kind of that journey you went on as an artist, as much as we can do in about 30 minutes. Yeah, so I think the first question I have is, what is your art? What sort of art do you make?
Now that makes me curious about my artistic practice. What kind of art do I make? That's always a question that is really difficult for an artist. What kind of art do you make? Because I don't know. I mean, I know what I use to make art. I know what the production is, but I don't really know what I do. I think anyway. No, I'm getting into a more of a philosophical discussion which has no end. So I'll just continue. I make work based on walking, photography, video, reading and writing, and whatever else I haven't been doing at the moment.
Yeah, and I know you sent some of your pamphlets from different exhibits you've done, and yeah, it is very broad and there's a lot going on. So we'll see how much of it we can dig into in our time together. Yeah, I guess maybe let's start with the walking part of it, because that's a big part of your practice, right? Yeah, tell me more about that, about the walking side of things.
Well, I always walked. As a youth, it was, I mean, the idea of walking, because you always see things, there's something to think about, there's something to do. I loved being outside. It was always part of, so if I had nothing, if I was just sort of feeling like I had nothing to do when I was inside, I'd just go for a walk, no matter what time of year, what the temperature or the weather was like. I remember in Cranbrook, well, I started doing things like, as I say, that I walked out of necessity a lot. You know, in Calgary, I didn't like waiting for buses, so I started walking because, you know, minus 30 weather, and you didn't know. I mean, at the time in the late 50s, early 1960s, the bus was kind of erratic, and there was no way of finding out if there's actually a bus running. I think it was just a bus stop, and quite often I would wait for a bus, which I knew ran to that spot, and then later on find out that they didn't run on the day that I was waiting. So it made sense to walk. I'd say, okay, I'll wait, I'll walk to the next bus stop, and then the next bus stop, and then the next bus stop. until I said, well, I'm so far now, I might as well just keep on walking, save myself whatever the fare was. And in Cranbrook, also as a young person, although I just walked because I had there was no transit as far as I remember, so you walked. And I had no desire at the time to get a driver's license. I was not a big fan. The idea of driving didn't really attract me that much. So I just walked. And I started walking in Calgary to the airport, which in the old days was closer than it is. It's like the southern part of the current airport. Yes. So, because there was what I call a plane on a stick, which was a Lancaster Flying Fortress bomber, which I liked for some reason. So but anyways, it was an excuse to walk out to the airport and take a look and then walk back. So that was quite a few kilometers. And then I liked walking to the zoo, which was farther. And I also, my mother, I think, gave me an old camera she used to use, which was a Brownie reflex camera, which was a twin lens, a viewing lens and a taking lens, a very simple one. And I started taking pictures using that. And I would, especially around the zoo, I took a lot of pictures of the zoo at the time, which was, it was the old days zoo with bars and cement and cages. That was it. It was like a jail. So I took photographs of that, and then other things, and then later on, well, then like everybody else, I started driving. My father had a 55 Willys Jeep, which we drove around in quite a bit, so like, 55 Willys Jeep is a very rough utility thing, very small, no back seats. So it's like, and no heater, manual windshield wipers. And it was we drove back and forth between Calgary and Cranbrook and that for quite some time until he got a company car, I think, and then the Jeep sat until eventually when I bought it from him, and then took it and then spent a year restoring it, not restoring it, but essentially restoring it, rebuilding the engine, et cetera, which was my introduction to driving.
Yeah, and great. And so you have this. You're walking a lot. You have your camera that your mother gave you. You're taking photos. And was it kind of like an organic process of like, this eventually becoming part of your artistic practice as far as incorporating walking and photography kind of together?
Well, it became sort of like a normal thing to do because you take pictures. If you have a camera, you take pictures, and it just at the time I can't remember what I was thinking back then, but it just seemed like a normal thing to do, and I didn't really think about it as any kind of unusual activity. My grandmother was always a photographer. He took photographs all the time. My grandfather died when my father was quite young, so there was no grandfather figure around, and my great-grandfather died when everybody was young. So it was a small, sort of contained family. And it was also, I like looking at things. So when you're looking at things, you want to keep that memory or something like that. So that was sort of the start, and not so much a photography and an artistic practice, but an idea of looking critically at things. And looking critically is sort of the basis of photography or an art practice. Mm-hmm. Is seeing things and you're looking just beyond the surface.
Yeah, and I guess like kind of incorporating that into the walking, just because it's so central to, from what I read from your work, your pieces, because it's not just that you're walking and taking photos, because that's what a lot of people do. It's kind of bigger than that and broader than that. So in some of the residencies you've done, you spend sometimes a month at a time in a place, right? Like at Winnipeg, for example. And so you'll go around and you'll be taking photos, you'll be collecting things. It's a big process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a bit about that process now.
Well, I mean, those things I did, there was a series of gallery exhibitions called erratic drawings.
Erratic spaces.
Space. Well, it's actually, there was erratic space, was what I termed it, but spaces becomes what people say, which is fine, because it is multiple things. But the idea of erratic space came from the book I showed you in the last episode, the Francisco Carrari, who was an architect who devised the sort of notion, the origin of architecture, which he determined was through walking. And he looked at the development of the human race, of Homo, the multiple Homo things, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo anyway, all of those, through a trajectory of walking. And he started, the idea of his first beginning is that people were within this idea of classifying space. He called the first space erratic space, which was a space that was unknown, unmapped, and you just found out about it as you moved. So it was a sense of hunting-gathering thing, where you would just you walk until you found something you needed, plants, water, fish, whatever, and then you stay there until it was depleted or whatever, and then you'd move on, or the weather was getting too harsh. So you move on until you found something else, and then this continual movement through space, which was just unmapped, there's no memory of, so you wouldn't go back to a space. So erratic space was that kind of thing, and I wanted to treat spaces as erratic in that sense, unmapped. So I look at a city as an erratic location, an erratic terrain, and even though cities are very firmly gridded and mapped, but it's also the idea of finding out things, so it's finding ways through a city that are not mapped, which brings into this idea of desire lines, which are paths that people make unconsciously because, like say you're facing a mapped gridded space, like at a university or something, the sidewalk goes here and then goes down there. So but instead of going there and down there, you go across the lawn. And eventually there's a path. So that's the idea of the movement of erratic space within erratic terrain, within a mapped space. But within his, within Carrari's idea, that this notion of the beginning of architecture was that throughout erratic space, people would eventually decide that there would be something worth coming back to, because they encountered it many times or whatever. This is over thousands of years, of course. So they would start making cairns or monuments of some kind to remind them of a space. And this was the introduction of nomadic terrain, or the idea of some place where it's semi-mapped, you go back to certain places at certain times of the year, and then so you move through as a nomadic society. You move continually, seasonally or whatever, through this process. And then the final one was sedentary space, which came about with the idea that, well, instead of traveling all the time to find something, why don't we just grow it? And so the beginning of farming and communities and settlements, which became sedentary terrain. So that process stimulated this kind of walking idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, like, my understanding when I read about your pieces is part of it is like you're interacting with people as you're walking, right?
Quite often.
Yeah. What is that kind of, and that's also like part of because I remember in one of the pamphlets it mentioned like it's not necessarily goal driven, that you're trying to get somewhere. It is more process driven. And it seemed like, interacting with people was part of that process, right?
Well, it's part of it. I mean, you run into people. There's all kinds of interactions but sometimes there's nobody around, of course. I mean, it's empty space. And a lot of time you're interacting with people who live in empty space, which is interesting. I mean, the idea of people who are unhoused or sort of that notion of movement through a space, which also came about when I was driving buses in Vancouver, because like you're sort of moving. I was also, I mean, I decided that early on when I was finished my undergrad that I wanted to. I was disillusioned with academia. I never wanted anything more with academia, so I got jobs in places I wanted to work at. So I would get bus driving jobs, or I started driving taxi, and then I figured, well, if I'm going to be driving all the time, I might as well be making a better wage. So I got a truck license at the Class 1 for semi-trucks. But I didn't do much of that. But then I got a job driving double-decker buses in Victoria, which was great, because you're telling stories. And you're researching a place, and you're telling stories and this and that to a gullible crowd. And so you try to stay as close to the truth as possible, but then you also depend on people to fill in gaps. Especially, because I would go take them to the Butchart Gardens, which is north of Victoria, which is a beautiful garden place, and I would do these double-decker bus tours around town, and take them up and drop them there, but then do a tour of the gardens, which meant I had to find out what names of flowers and bushes and plants, and the history of the place. And of course, when you're doing that, people like to play jokes on you. And then they insist that the name of something was different than what you say. So you say, oh yeah, you sound like you know what you're talking about. Until I can look it up, I'll just start using that. And then later on, someone else would disagree with you, saying, well, no, this is not that, this is this, which is what I originally called it. Anyway, so there's this notion of this idea of jokes coming into it, of misleading, of storytelling, and how the stories develop through moving through space. And later, other jobs I had were driving motor coaches through from BC, Oregon, Washington, Montana, back to Alberta, up through the Rockies, and Jasper, Banff, back to Vancouver. So that circuit through that space, which was quite rich in history. And I'd been in Victoria doing my undergrad, and I worked at the Royal BC Archives for a while, which gave me this history into this notion, well, what is and what is not represented in official archives. So I decided what I was going to do is start working on documenting unofficial archives, the work that's, what is not represented within cities. So I was looking at both sides of this thing. I mean, the things that aren't in archives are things that people don't want, whoever is producing the archival work, the photographers and whatnot, that end up in archives are not photographing the things. They're working for governments, they're working for business, they're working for this and that. So they're trying to produce the best work possible. So you get lots of business photographs of people opening buildings, or opening businesses, new buildings under construction, that sort of thing, government contracts. And then also a few the idea of the colonization of a place. So the 19th century photographs of the construction of the city, through all those businesses, government things, whatnot, but also through the people's, the First Nation people who lived there who were being displaced, and how they fit in, but very obviously represented very stereotypically without any kind of explanatory process. So this was the kind of thing I was thinking about when I was doing these bus tours. And then I got a job in Yukon, at Dawson City, driving bus, and also managing the regional manager of a bus tour company, and which was very interesting.
How so?
Well, because it's the Arctic, it's the North. I said, the city, the idea of the Arctic is full of stories. It's just rich with stories, colonial stories and narratives, the gold rushes. The gold rush really struck me because it was such a 19th century phenomenon. I started working on that in Victoria, and then later on I worked in Wells, BC, which is a gold mining town, Wells Barkerville, which was the scene of I can't remember the dates anymore, but but the gold rush that started, the Fraser River Gold Rush, when the gold was discovered, and then up the Fraser to the Caribou, and then Wells, Barkerville, which was the largest city in BC at a certain point in the 19th century, because of the astoundingly rich gold deposits which were there. So this whole idea of boom and bust business developing the west of the colonial Americas became really interesting to me. So I started following that and went down to California and photographed the strikes in 1849 and worked my way up. And also down a bit to Mexico, but then back up again to the north, up to Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk, and also Alaska. So I'm really rambling. I have no idea what the question was.
Yeah. What is your art? No, no, I'm kidding. No. Yeah, but
I'll just continue. I might figure it out.
Yeah, no, I'll steer that. We'll steer things. Yeah, I guess that's interesting. Yeah, because when you're describing that, your artistic practice, as I read about it, is so much centered around walking. Mm-hmm. And so in those times, you're traveling a lot of distance by vehicle. You're giving those bus tours. You're seeing these places as you're driving as well. How is that different for you when you're driving through a city or doing a bus tour back in the day versus like, okay, now I'm walking? How does that change how you perceive a city?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you know the concept of the flaneur.
I read it, but what is it? Tell us.
Okay, so it was developed in a certain sense by a 19th century writer, Baudelaire, who wrote it in an essay, I think, called "The Painter of Modern Life." But the flaneur was the idea of a Parisian stroller, a dandy, who got dressed up and wandered up and down the boulevards with on display. And this became sort of a catchword for this notion of walking. That, okay, the flaneur is detached and wandering, but also an object of observation and delight in a certain sense. So and it was taken up by many artistic movements like the surrealists, the Dada group, the Situationist International, and other. Anyway, so this notion of walking as an art practice became very sort of entrenched within these early 20th century art practices. I mean, the surrealists would do things like were believed in coincidence and spontaneity. So they would form these groups who would just sort of meet somewhere and then do nothing. Theoretically, nothing. So and then, but then the Situationists, Guy Debord was one of the founders of that, looked at walking as being sort of political, and also things like student. He worked around in France around the 60s, and the work around the walking, which they called the dérive or the drift, was that you just walk until you then you decide if for no reason something would happen, you turn, and then you turn some other way. So it would be unplanned walks into this sort of notion. But it's a political movement in the sense of you're wasting time, you're loitering. And it's sort of an anti-capitalist idea that you're just loitering. And their group culminated in the 1968 in the student riots in Paris, which was the ultimate situationist act of street walk and destruction and political activity. So, the walking does have a rich history within these different manifesto-based art movements. And I forgot why I started talking about that.
Yeah, and so I asked about, like, your experience, like within your artistic practice of incorporating walking. Mm-hmm. So it has that rich history in that certain art form. Yeah. I guess how does that influence how you do that? Are you more of that wandering around, kind of going where you want to? How does it influence your artistic practice when you're walking?
Well, I just, I like to walk and then sort of, well, like sort of following the notion of the erratic space, just sort of say, not following a map, just walking until you had to, you're in a T intersection. Do you turn right? Do you turn left? Why do you turn right? Why do you turn left? What's this sort of thing? But the situationists have developed a process called psychogeography, which sort of meant you're mapping through emotional ideas rather than physical ideas. So they would say, well, like as an example, say that you're walking regularly, so you walk to the shops, and the walk you would normally, the shortest walk, say, that you would take has some kind of emotional or psychological obstruction, something you don't want to deal with. So instead of taking the shortest one, you take another route, a more roundabout route. But then if something else happens, so like this notion of a map developed by well, just the idea of the psyche of the walker. And I forgot, just going back to Francisco Carrare, the idea of sedentary space. Well, back to nomadic space. Nomadic space, when you find something you go back to every year, and this and that. So, like, it's an idea of nomadism. You have a route that you take, but sometimes something will happen. Like there'll be, your competitor groups set up camp along your route, and then you don't want to have problems, so you go around it. They claim that territory. So it's this notion of negotiation of space with other groups. So when you're walking in a city, you're negotiating space with the city council and private property owners, and also construction sites, natural figures. Like, well, yeah, if you walk, sometimes all congregate in one place because that's the only bridge across the river, unless you want to swim or walk, whatever. So there's always these negotiations that are going on when you're route finding or walking somewhere. There's also some other ideas that, well, when you're going someplace, you say, well, do I want to go there? What's the point? I'm dying. I need a beer, or I need a coffee, or I need bandages for my blisters. So it's like, I'll go this way instead. Mm-hmm. So it's a physical, the physical aspects, the emotional aspects, the psychological aspects, all of those things come into play.
Yeah, and I feel like there's when you describe that, I feel like there's possibly a difference between just like you said, walking somewhere to run an errand. And I feel like people so often, efficiency is what they want, especially in today's day and age. Mm-hmm. You plug in your online map and take me to this route, what's the most efficient way? And mm-hmm. When you're describing kind of that artistic or older sense of walking, that wandering, meandering, things like that, I feel like perhaps we don't do that as much anymore. There's less of just wandering around to experience, to think, and to not be busy and buy things versus just get somewhere. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, it's just convenience. People, walking is not something which is common. When you look, when I was in Los Angeles, the only people you saw walking were people who needed to walk or take transit. Like the housekeepers, gardeners, whatnot. Well, the gardeners generally had trucks with tools and whatnot, but mostly like housekeepers, domestic workers, that sort of thing, was coming from the barrio to the rich people's houses. And nobody was walking on the street except me. And that would always result in twitching curtains as you passed. And that comes back to the notion of walking as a transgressive act. Because when you're walking somewhere, you have everything you need for the day on your back. Mm-hmm. So you got a backpack. So you got errands to do as well. I think I'll pick up some beer. So you go into the beer store and you find yourself being followed around by store security because you're suspicious. You don't just walk in, well, unless if you're a male. Apparently, according to the New Yorker article by a retail security chief in large department stores, the most suspicious character in a store is a male with a bag or a knapsack. It was looking at things and not buying. So that's the one to keep an eye on, because they're shopping. And males don't shop. They go in, they buy something, they leave, according to that construct. So breaking it down, anyone with a bag becomes more suspicious. So, and of course also, if you're black or First Nation or whatever, then you're constantly followed around shops. Or, if you look like it. So, being treated like a thief or a potential thief is part of the deal. And that way, it is, in a sense, transgressive, but it's not deliberately. It's unconscious that you realize after a certain amount of time, especially if as a white male who has the privilege of going anywhere they want without question, but suddenly you're questioned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, especially I find that fascinating about the different types of people who might be forced to walk, who can drive. I think even just more generally, like, in North America, it's very much a driving culture, and people drive around. And you're right. If you have a car, you're not going to be carrying a backpack and all your supplies with you, and you just I get that sense of, like, I think it's also part of it is about density, and if most people were walking. Like let's say a very big example, like the community of Santiago, right? That is a pilgrimage. Right. People walk, and they do other things. They bike and whatever else, but mostly walking. But that's seen as like there's a large group of people doing it. I just see a difference in that, as opposed to, like you said, transgressive. It's one person. Maybe they're seen as suspicious. People are like closing their blinds or something. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? About lots of people walking versus like one person walking, and how that might change how we see walking as a recreation or suspicious or other things?
Well, it is very much differently. You look at, as I say, Los Angeles, streets are empty. In New York City, it's a walking city. The streets are jammed with people walking. And it's much different atmosphere that people are accustomed. And when I was in California, I was doing my MFA at the California Institute of the Arts, and one of my instructors was Pat Ward-Williams, I think. She was an African-American photographer from Philadelphia, and she was here, and she said she couldn't abide living in Los Angeles and moved back to Philadelphia because she said there's no street life. In Philadelphia, you sit on your stoop and you're engaged. It's constant moving. The idea that there are people around, you talk to them. It's a constant negotiation. Whereas in Los Angeles, you're just there, and there as an object of suspicion. Not only for walking, but as a black person walking. I also knew it was this guy, a photographer as well. He was black. I can't remember his name offhand. But he was, your stereotypical dangerous black male. He was large, tall, very black. And he said, well, when he walked, he'd go into a rich neighborhood like Bel Air or something, and within minutes there'd be a police car saying, what are you doing? Why are you here? Whereas someone like me would have been less suspect, perhaps, but still probably questioned at some point. Maybe.
We'll get the beard, kind of suspicious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's an anarchist. There's a bomb thrower down there.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, yeah. I think it's just we could talk endlessly about walking and all the elements of that. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment.
Oh, damn.
But it's okay. It goes by quick. So this has been the Windy City's Finest on location with Mac and Perry. I'm Mac. He's Perry.
Hello and welcome once again to another segment of the Windy City's Finest, on location with Mac and Perry. I'm Perry, he's Mac, and this is
Don.
Yes, and I'm super excited to dive into this next segment with you, Don. It's kind of our showcase segment where we're going to look at some specific pieces and hear the story behind them and just learn a bit more about them and they're for you. So the first one we'll start with is this one right here. And before we started, you had mentioned that these, I believe, were kind of part of a new blog system that you started. What can you tell me about that?
Well, these are from a project I started in 2013. And it was one I started with my research partner, Ava.
Right.
Here. And she was well, this is her hometown, Turin. And we adopted her we hired her in a certain sense through adoption from a ranch where she was a working cattle dog. She was a border collie, she was a working cattle dog, and so very attuned to the project. And so, but the rancher, for various reasons, was downsizing the number of working dogs he had, and Ava was on the list. So anyway, we ended up with her, and he was looking for someone who would work the dog, because he put a lot of training and time and whatnot. And she was very good, a very good working dog. Anyway, so what we decided to do was we would just do a walk every day. And with the first year, we started going to all the small towns within a region of Lethbridge, and I'd walk the street. And this is Turin, Alberta, just north of Lethbridge, and that was where Ava was on a ranch around there. And we would walk, and I would map it with a GPS, and then make these photographs on the walk, and then map it with prints. So we did that every day for the first year. It was going to be a one-year project. And then I made a series of books called something. What was it called? Erratic Drawings in 12 volumes. And referring to the drawings of the walk. And I did I made a series of volumes, one book per month for the year. So these are all from that project.
Right. And I really appreciate the fact. So I'm curious, who was leading the walk? Was it Ava or was it yourself?
It was a negotiation.
I love that.
I mean, that's the whole thing with walking with a non-human intelligence, which is how I looked at it, is that we had we were collaborators. She was a partner. Yeah. She wasn't working for me. She was a full partner. So, and she had ideas, and she had her own opinion. She had very strong opinions of what she wanted to deal with. But she was also very firmly into the whole notion of being a working dog. And so we had to negotiate things like what she wanted to do versus what I wanted to do. And normally what I would want to do, she would agree to. Right. Except on certain circumstances in which what she wanted to do took precedence. Yeah. And it became very interesting. As we started walking, I'd walk the grid of the town. And but after that, we'd go out in the country, well, farther into the country, because we're already in the country. And we started walking the canal system. So anyway, so we worked the both. We either start at one part of a canal and walk until 5 or 6 K or 15K or whatever we wanted to do, and then decide, well, this is far enough. Then we turn around and walk back. Right. And then next time we'd come to start where we finished and park there, and then walk. So doing that in segments, we walked almost the entire canal system of the St. Mary's River Irrigation District. Wow. Yeah. And been parts of the other ones are surrounding. Wow. And I'm really cluing into that idea. You've talked about this idea of instead of walking simply for efficiency or getting something done, it's emotional, it can serve an emotional purpose. And I'm really curious what that experience is like with another being, be they human or not.
What can you tell me about that?
Well, that's much that is the interesting part, walking with other people, because then again, or other intelligences even, like Deva was, she was a worker, she wanted to walk, she wanted to do stuff, she needed something to do. So we'd walk immense distances sometimes, but then she'd say, that's enough. And then she'd go find a shady spot and lie down, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then and she got older, she got more opinionated on those matters. Anyway, but walking with people is also a similar thing. It's like they don't have the same interests. So I say, well, let's walk here. And they say, okay, well, why? What do you mean, why? There's nothing here. You know, what do you mean, walk here? You're nuts. You're out of your mind. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I did one, it was one residency. It was a very interesting residency in Merida in Yucatan. We were there for a month. And it was 10 people, 5 writers and 5 photographers, 10 or 12 people, I can't remember. But anyway, half of which were writers, the other half which were photographers. And it was called the Arts and Writing Exchange, or something of that nature. So we'd work together, we'd work, and so what I'd try to do then is we'd go for a walk every day with every other participant in the place, and we'd just have conversations and walk, and then see which they had things they were interested in showing me, or so that sort of thing. But also we'd rent cars and drive to other places and walk there. Also we went to the whole region around Merida and into the next state, which I can't remember the name of offhand.
That's okay. Yeah, I think there's something interesting there in relation to what you said previously about photography and maybe the nature of I don't know if interrogating is the right word, but thinking critically or viewing critically of like really considering what it is you're seeing and the context in which you're seeing it, and just how that works with others. And you're obviously taking photos along these walks in these projects. So I'm curious how the decision to take a photo of something, is there a intentionality to it, or is it kind of like it just happens, or what can you tell me about that?
Well, it's this idea of thinking about things beyond the surface. So, it's the old barn sort of thing. Like you take a picture of an old barn, which is a popular fine art photography thing, like the weathered boards, the romanticism of the empty barn in a landscape, and that sort of thing. But then also, in the West, when you see something like that, it's also from the boom and bust thing of settlement and of the whole idea that of dry land farming was being sold as a new miracle thing.
Right.
So
and you had called that sedentary.
Well, the sedentary space is a building of villages,
right? Oh, okay.
And farming.
Yeah.
So, but this would be, in a sense, nomadic, I guess, because the idea is that let's go back to this place or that place.
Yeah.
And so that's what nomadic is. That you start building cairns, which is the origin of architecture and that sort of thing. Yeah. And then, so we would walk and talk about things and go to places, to like a library, an archive, a museum, or just a place that they'd seen when they were walking in town or driving or whatever. I was one of the only real walkers there. Most people wanted to take the bus. I refused. Except once.
Right on. And can you tell me a bit about these 3 photos and the idea of placing photos together? Because I imagine these weren't the only photos you maybe took on this walk, unless they were. But I'm curious what goes into deciding which photos you include.
Well, this is New Dayton. Is there a scratch? It is, okay. Yeah. Anyway, New Dayton, south of Lethbridge, and so you have the New Dayton Cafe, ND Cafe, like a center, would be a central sort of meeting place, now empty or having something else. So it's like a past history.
Right.
And then the sign, welcome to New Dayton, it's a tiny, tiny place.
Right.
but with the, you know, the wagon wheel suggesting farming, and then Ava, of course. is
Yes, I
always
just noticed Ava, yeah.
so, and then this is snow geese.
Snow geese.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, okay.
So it's a photograph of a big flock of snow geese. in the
Right,
background.
okay.
And then the graphic of walking the grid.
Hmm. And so this is one trip, like one day that you went out?
Just the one walk.
Wow, okay, yeah.
So, and that would be how many kilometers? Oops, 6.1 K.
Whoa, okay, yeah. Ava put you to work, it sounds like.
Oh gosh, you did.
Nice.
And so this project, and this one is, this is Hardyville, which had, what is that? Oh, right. Ava investigating the mining ruins. So this, you know, just in North Lethbridge, which was, you know, Hardyville, which was apparently a spot for the Japanese Canadian settlement. You know, even post-internment. I'm not sure about pre-internment because the Japanese Canadians were never interned in Alberta,
Right.
and so the internees came from BC basically. But also the mining history. So it's a sense is that, okay, like going back to the old barn. So like you see, so, you know, it's something which is seen as an aesthetic, purely aesthetic, design-oriented project by certain kinds of fine art photographers, but someone with a critical eye would also say it's, you know, the idea of abandonment of farms with the bust of the dry land farming boom in the early part of the century, last century. That people would come because it was an unusually moist, rainy year or decade, and after the decade, things went back to normal. No rain.
Yeah.
Everything died. You know, everybody had borrowed a lot of money for farm implements and whatnot, and then their crops died, and the crop failures, and they couldn't pay it back. So, you know, homesteads were abandoned and whatnot.
This brings to mind like something that I think you talked about with Mac, and it's that idea of like, I forget the specific lingo that you had used, but it's that idea of like building a monument to remind people like to come back to a space or that something's there. And this feels like a version of that, but unintentional. Like I see this tractor and it's kind of a monument in its own right, but is maybe unintentional. Or maybe people do this intentionally sometimes with fancy cars that aren't going to work, so they'll plant it somewhere and just leave it.
Well, you see it all over the place, particularly in the back alleys.
Yeah, yeah.
Like cars, vans sitting there for years. I mean, I did that. You know, I had this whole diesel Nissan pickup,
Yeah.
which I thought was a great idea when I bought it in Saskatchewan. It turned out to be a really bad idea because it was a lousy diesel engine. I mean, it wouldn't turn on. You had to plug it in if it was lower than 10 above.
I see, yeah.
And then it produced massive black clouds of diesel smoke when it while it was warm. Oh God, it was horrible.
Anyway,
So
we can
anyway,
move on from it.
so I left it in my back behind behind my house on the north side for a decade or thereabouts. And people, you know, they broke the window and just go in and sleep inside and this and that, you know. But eventually, someone came and said, "Could they have it?"
Yeah.
I said yes.
Yeah, like
Take it.
absolutely. Where have you been all this time?
Yeah. And it started right up, of course.
Oh wow.
It had been sitting for years, and then the battery was dead, so I put a new battery in, or I charged the battery, something. Anyway, so they are monuments
Yeah.
in a time. They take that, but then you look at ideas of monuments, how long they last.
Yeah.
Some last for a long time, other ones last for a short time.
And is there an element of like preserving that in any way, shape, or form in your work, that you kind of capture these things, whether or not they do last for 10, 20 more years or not?
No, I don't know. That's a good question. That's something I've thought about, but I think they exist in the moment. Like my pickup existed as a pickup for a while, and then it became housing for a while, and then it became a party site, and then it became someone's project in their back alley garage. So it's the notion of this. It's an idea of transition and change. That monuments are fixed and don't change, whereas everything else changes.
Yeah.
So the idea of the new Dayton Cafe, which is back the other one,
Yeah.
it changed. And Ava, which you see here,
Yeah.
telling me it was time to go for a walk.
Yeah. The paw on the newspaper. I
Yeah,
love
she was
it.
very insistent. Like anyway, she was
Yeah.
great. That's a great memory. She passed on last spring at 15. So
Wow.
we had a good 12-year run.
Yeah. How far, if you had to guess, do you think you walked together?
Oh God, it's thousands of kilometers.
Yeah. and sorry.
Oh, I'd say we went every day for a year.
Yeah. And I think in there's something about that idea of like consistency and building up over time. I think a lot of times in people's artistic practice, it's like all at once or nothing. Whereas I'm getting this very much this sense of like just consistency of an everyday kind of practice. And what can you tell me about that, if that's even accurate to your experience?
Well, that's a good point. I was thinking about it. I always think about it, well, I just never finish anything. It just keeps going.
Right.
And so I'll show various bits and pieces of it as it continues.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens.
Yeah.
I'm not a project-oriented person, in the sense is that I have done projects, but they're never satisfying, because once they're done, they're done. And then what use are they? In some sense. And the idea of doing projects is more like I don't know. I just can't figure that out.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I see a parallel. We're kind of at the end of our time here, so maybe this is what we'll end off on, but maybe a parallel between our lives and a work as a project. It's like our lives are not necessarily a project. They're a thing that goes until it doesn't, and yeah, it's like hard to be like, okay, now I'm done, so I can die. It's like I don't think we really get to that point, There's like never necessarily an end point. It just keeps going, and then at some point it doesn't.
Well, some photographers continue right up to that last moment.
Right. Yeah.
Like, what's her name? Hannah, who was a performance artist and performed in the nude, and then she, in her youth, and then over her career, she continued doing the same thing, and then at the end, she died of cancer. But she documented everything right up to the end in terms of a performance.
Right.
And the medical stuff, the tubes, and also Joe Spence, which is another artist who did a similar thing, with the idea of you're still alive. Why are you being subject to the medical intervention stuff? What you've lost, you lost your autonomy to a medical system. So it's like trying to retain that, retain that agency over yourself. So anyway, so it just keeps going.
Yeah, it keeps going. I think that's a wonderful note to end off on. Bit of a darker, more serious topic overall, but
right.
I think we got to talk about those things sometimes.
I know it gets back to the cremation or
absolutely, it does. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight, and for letting us take a look at some of your work. And Ava, of course, thank you so much. Yeah, that's all the time we have for this segment. So this has been the Windy City's Finest, on location with Mac and Perry. He's Mac.